Hello viewers, today we will discuss the topic Dimension of Labor Market Inequalities in Africa. Every market has buyers and sellers, and the labor market is no exception. The buyers are employers and the sellers are workers. Some of these participants may not be active at any given moment in the sense of seeking new employees or new jobs, but on any given day, thousands of firms and workers will be in the market trying to transact. Labor market inequality has become the subject of growing interest in recent years across the world, and there has been a realization that growing inequality not only undermines social justice objectives but can also have adverse economic consequences. Labor market inequality. Inequality is different from poverty, but related to it. Inequality concerns variations in living standards across a whole population. By contrast, poverty focuses only on those whose standard of living falls below an appropriate threshold level, such as a poverty line. This threshold may be set in absolute terms based on externally determined norms such as calorie requirements, or in relative terms, for example, a fraction of the overall average standard of living. Intuitively, relative poverty is more closely related to inequality, in that what it means to be poor reflects prevailing living conditions in the whole population. But the degree of inequality will have implications for both conceptions of poverty. In nature, the same must also apply to variations in well-being between people or groups of people, that is, inequality. This multidimensionality is the fundamental disparity that permits one individual certain material choices while denying another individual those very same choices. These material choices and the factors that permit or deny them are themselves multidimensional. This definition also reflects a fundamental focus on inequality between individuals or group of individuals. It encompasses both inequality in opportunities and inequality in outcomes. It can allow for different time horizons over which these choices can be permitted or denied. And yet, broader perspectives on inequality can still be developed. As with poverty, in practice, it is generally easiest to consider the different dimensions of inequality separately. These dimensions are well known from discussions of poverty, including education, health and nutrition, security, power, social inclusion, income or consumption, and assets. Though distinct, these different dimensions of inequality are often related to each other, even if the correlation is not perfect. Labor market inequalities across world. Labor market opportunities are unequally distributed, not only among different countries, but also over different subgroups. This is true of access to the labor market, that is employment, but applies also to the types of jobs people get, including aspects such as the accompanying form of contract, working hours, and benefits entailed in terms of earnings in particular, but also of social security and fringe benefits. Inequalities also persist when looking at unemployment rather than employment, with specific groups being more likely to enter and remain in unemployment. At the household level, income from wages depends on both the level of wages received by members who are paid employees and on the number of members who are paid employees. Indeed, when undertaking the decomposition, the distribution of household wages is affected not only by the change in distribution of wages of paid employees, but also by the fact that wages fall to zero If some members of the household lose their jobs as paid employees or increase from zero to a positive value when a household member gets a job as paid employee. If a household member loses his or her job and is eligible for unemployment benefits, wages fall to zero and unemployment benefits turn positive. Job losses and wage cuts are the major factors in changes in inequality. In developed countries, the labor market effect, that is, wage plus employment effects, would have increased inequality in two-thirds of countries if other income sources had not offset the increase. In these countries, where inequality did increase, other income sources offset about one-third of the increase in inequality generated by the labor market effect. In Spain and the United States, the two countries where inequality increased most, the labor market effect accounted for respectively 90% and 140% of the increase in inequality, meaning that in Spain, inequality was further increased by other income sources, while in United States, as in some other countries, other income sources partially offset the increase in inequality caused by the labor market effect. Among the emerging and developing economies, the labor market has also been an important factor in explaining inequality trends. In fact, few countries succeeded in reducing top-bottom inequality over the past decade without also reducing inequality in the labor market. However, some countries saw declines in wage inequality while experiencing growing income equality due to changes in other sources of household income. The Table 1 shows the estimated Gini coefficients for different regions between 1993 and 1998. For Africa, this has declined in 1998 to 42.7%. Same is the case with Asia and Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, the decline was more substantial of almost 20%. In other regions, inequality has increased in 1998 compared to 1993. For the world, it declined from 66% in 1993 to 62.8% in 1998. Labor market in Africa. There are some signs that employment creation in Africa is strengthening. This has led to the first decline in the incidence of unemployment since 2011. Signs of inequality, distress, and vulnerability can be seen in African labor markets. Child labor remains high across the region, with 9.2 million child laborers reported in Northern Africa and the Middle East. In Egypt, around 1.6 million children aged 5 to 17 are considered child laborers. In Sudan, it is estimated that 4% of the labor force is composed of children aged 6 to 9 years old, representing some 47% of children. There are also cases of uneven social protection. Also, in sub-Saharan Africa, vast majority of workers find themselves in informal or vulnerable employment. According to various studies, the informal economy in the region contributes 50 to 80% of GDP, 60 to 80% of employment, and 90% of new jobs. 9 out of 10 workers in both rural and urban areas are estimated to hold only informal jobs. The share of informality varies across the region. Informal employment is lower in Southern Africa, where it ranges from 32.7% in South Africa to 43.9% in Namibia. In the other sub-Saharan African countries for which data are available, the percentage exceeds 50% and reaches as high as 76.2% in the United Republic of Tanzania, 89.2% in Madagascar, and 93.5% in Uganda. Unfortunately, most people in informal work are in low-skilled jobs, exposed to inadequate and unsafe working conditions, with inadequate training opportunities, low wages, and long working hours, and no social protection. Dimensions of inequality in African labor markets. The figure 1 shows that inequality can be result of differences in educational attainment, age, or gender. Inequality can have several dimensions and can arise because of many reasons. African economies inherited highly unequal societies from the colonial era, while the early post-colonial decades exhibited some reduction in inequalities across classes when an increasing number of Africans found employment and started businesses. The period of neoliberal reforms since the 1980s has re-exacerbated inequalities between capital and labor, but also across regions and ethnic groups. There is thus a large, poorly paid, footloose reserve army of labor in many rural areas who toil under the radar screen of most governments and international aid agencies. Education-based inequality. Education in sub-Saharan Africa is often seen as the main policy instrument in the fight against inequality. In practice, however, although education is an intrinsic component of development and well-being, its economic value is not clear, as urban unemployment in sub-Saharan Africa is rising, especially among educated workers. Markets in African countries are imperfect, and the nature of work contracts interferes significantly in the relationship between human capital endowments and earnings. Education is important for labor market outcomes, strongly influencing both the distribution of employment and wage dispersion. Table 2 shows the change in Gini coefficients for 3 years for African population and separately for races. Gini coefficient measures the inequality, and closer its value to 100%, greater will be the inequality. Its value for Africa changes from 0.55 to 0.61 and to 0.68 in 1993, 2000 and 2008. The increasing value shows that inequality is increasing over time. This increasing trend is shown for all races as well. As an aggregate, the Gini coefficient in percentage increases from 0.66 to 0.68 and then to 0.70. Gender-based inequality. Women and certain ethnic groups often face unequal treatment in labor markets in both developed and developing countries. Many studies examine ethnic and gender wage gaps in developed countries. In contrast, only 3% of the studies on the gender wage gap draw on African data. As a result, little is known about inequalities in labor market outcomes in Africa. There is presence of gender inequalities for both wage earners and self-employed workers. In Guinea, differences in individual characteristics account for only 45% of the gender gap in earnings from self-employment and 25% of differences in earnings from public sector employment. A recent study conducted by the World Bank revealed that in Botswana, men have an up to 44% advantage over women in paid employment. They are also twice as likely as women to be employed in professional job categories. Similarly, in Mali, men are 2 or 3 times more likely than women to be salaried workers. Women are more likely to be hired in low-paying clerical jobs or as unpaid family workers in Botswana. This effect is more pronounced in cities, towns, and urban villages. Women's share of employment has risen, but men still form the majority of the employed. African women and black women in general are least likely of all women and men to be in paid employment. They are most likely to be counted as economically inactive, meaning that they have never had a paid income of their own, nor are they seeking one. The growth in women's employment has also not reflected an improvement in the quality of jobs and the economic position of women. The new areas of employment for women have tended to be insecure, with increased flexibility, low pay, and low status. Thus, the feminization of work has been accompanied by declining quality of jobs, pay, and working conditions. Unemployment remains high for women, young African women in particular. In fact, there was an increase in unemployment rates in the first decade of democracy, and while this has since tapered off, there are still not enough new jobs being created to make much of a dent in the levels of unemployment. African women are still clustered within the lowest income groups. The Table 3 shows the shares of status in employment in 2008 for Africa and sub-regions. The vulnerable employment is the share of own account and contributing family workers in total employment. For each category, data is shown for male and female along with totals. It can be seen that in Africa, the own account workers accounted for 40.2% of the employment, followed by family workers that accounted for 28.6%, wages and salaried workers that accounted for 28.4%, and finally the employees that accounted for 2.8%. In males, the own account workers accounted for the largest percentage, that is 41.3%, and the least share was that of employees at 4%. In case of females, the largest share belonged to family workers at 42.4%, and the least was that of employees at 1%. In North Africa, the wages and salaried workers accounted for half of the total employment share, that is 50%, followed by own account workers at 22.2%, contributing family workers at 17.9%, and employees at 9.8%. In males and females both, the largest share was accounted by wages and salaried persons. In sub-Saharan Africa, own account workers made up the largest share, that is 44.2%, followed by family workers at 31%, wages and salaried workers at 23.5%, and employees at 1.2%. Again, for both males and females, the largest share in employment was contributed by own account workers, which means greater percentage was vulnerable. Age-based inequality. Various constraints affect the supply of child labor, the demand for education, or both. A first set of constraints stems from imperfections in the markets for labor and land. When a household does not have enough labor to work all the land it owns, it has two options: hire external labor or rent out or sharecrop part of its land. If external labor is not available because of labor market imperfections or a weak or non-existent land market, the household may put its children to work. Any factor that raises the opportunity cost of children's time tends to increase their labor participation and reduce their attendance at school. Until recently, the retirement age in most French-speaking capitals in West Africa was 55. However, only people who work for the government or private firms in the formal sector of the economy pay contributions and are therefore entitled to pensions. The majority of workers work in the informal sector and do not receive pensions. There is very little interest in seniors in the labor market, mainly because they represent just 5% of the population. Pensions in West Africa are very low, especially outside the public sector, suggesting that they act more like minimum survival income than replacement income. Retirees struggle to make their meager incomes meet family outlays. People who are 55 and older still make substantial contributions to the economic life of their households, but few seniors depend exclusively on their family's help. Women appear more dependent on family support than men. In fact, most household heads still have young children to support. Elderly heads of household often support adult children who have not yet entered the labor market. Conclusion. A range of labor and social policy institutions affect workers' access to the labor market, their earnings, and working conditions once employed, as well as the role of social policies in influencing income at work and providing protection to those who are not working. The first starting point is the recognition that market forces on their own will not lead to equitable labor markets. There is a need for government intervention, for active social partners that can shape policies, and for the political will and commitment of all parties to construct and strengthen institutions that can raise earnings at work as well as protect those who are out of the labor market. With this, we come to the end of today's lecture. We will meet next time with another interesting topic. Till then, take care. Goodbye.